Hello, everybody. Today, I have another episode for you in my series on feminist leadership. And today we're going to interview Aruna Rao, who is the co-founder, former ED, and former board chair, but still also board member at Gender at Work. And I'll talk in a moment a little bit more about it. Aruna, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to this conversation. For my audience, so I'm going to quickly summarize a very rough definition of feminist leadership. There's a lot more than we could say about that. If you want to dive deeper into some definitional issues, then please listen to an earlier episode with Abby Maxman at Oxfam America. So feminist leadership typically is seen to fall within the realm of models of transformational leadership, which is really a school of leadership thinking, where in a nutshell, the ability of leaders to motivate employees to find intrinsic meaning in their work and to go beyond what a job typically would require of them, an ability to generate that willingness, that energy is typical for various forms of transformational leadership. When it comes to feminist leadership, obviously, externally, we're talking about organizations and leaders who want to create a gender-just world. In this series, however, I am primarily focusing on how feminist leadership shows up internally inside organizations through things like a pushback on more charismatic or hero-based and individualistic leadership, a greater focus on a developmental style of leadership that is about growing people, that emphasizes shared leadership, distributed leadership, and where the personal obviously is the political, as we know famously from feminism, and where there's a focus on self-care and staff care. And we're looking at feminist leadership because a number of international NGOs and other organizations in this international social sector, some bilateral organizations or multilaterals as well, are increasingly taking up feminist leadership, at least aspirationally. And so I thought, let's have a couple of conversations about this. So now a little bit about Aruna. So Aruna is, as I said, the co-founder, former ED, former board chair, and still a board member of Gender at Work, which is a long-standing organization that offers both thought leadership and applied research, but also consulting, training, and reflection opportunities around gender at work, as it says, gender in organization. Aruna is also the co-host of a podcast that I highly recommend, Gender at Work, and we'll make sure to put a link in the show notes. She's the former board member of ActionAid International. She, back in the past, she was a leader in gender work at BRAC. She has a Ph.D. in educational administration and organizational behavior from Columbia, which is so impressive. And I love the work that Aruna has contributed to, together with David Keller and Srilata Badliwala, on deep structures in organizations. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and what that has to do with feminist leadership. And funnily enough, Aruna and I met each other more than 20 years ago or so through your partner, who used to be my colleague at the World Bank, which is just such a small world. So, Aruna, let's dive in. So for you, by way of background, tell me a little bit more about your overall body of work and how feminist leadership came to be a part of that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tosca. I'm really happy to be having this conversation with you. I think back in the late 90s, I had a wonderful opportunity to work with BRAC in Bangladesh. As you know, it is the largest NGO in the world, and clearly situated in a country where there are very strong social norms around how men should behave, how women should behave, who has access to what kinds of resources. And so here was an organization which allowed us to come in and help them think about change in their culture around gender equality. So that meant really working with a very large group of staff on the issues of organizational culture intersecting with individual attitudes and behaviors. And then throw in the middle, gender equality and what does that mean in that context? So we looked very closely collectively. BRAC staff were involved in a very large process of gender action learning. So they were looking at really how do gender power dynamics play out in organizational settings? And then how can we go about changing them? What small changes can we make at our level, and what are the larger systemic changes that are needed to be made at higher levels of decision making in the organization? So that was an incredible opportunity that I then worked with David Kelleher and Ricky Stewart to try to connect up with others who are working on similar issues, but in very different contexts. So people who worked on with the CGIAR system, the agricultural research institutions, people who worked in private sector, really trying to look at, and we were influenced by, the work of Peter Senge on looking at, cultural change, organizational change. And we tried to share what we were doing in these different contexts. So that led to the development of the first book that we published, Gender at Work, Organizational Change for Equality, in 1999. And then we tried, David and I particularly, as well as many others who were interested in this field, came together to try to find a way of doing more consistent work on this area of gender and institutional change. And that led to the birth of Gender at Work, this international feminist network, that exists now. And in the early days, I remember one of our founding board members, Joanna Kerr, who's now is very well known in the international NGO world. She said, "Okay, Aruna, you have focused on the most difficult thing to change in organizations. Power dynamics that people at the top don't really want you to change, working across sectors and working internationally. So, great, good luck. This is going to be a really tough sell." And I remember Kumi Naidu, also a board member, a founding board member, saying, "What are you really talking about? What is this that you're trying to change?" And it was difficult to really articulate and put into words these dynamics which are not obvious in organizations.
Yeah,
they're under the surface. Everybody knows they exist, and everybody feels them. Who gets access to what kinds of resources and what kinds of decisions? Who gets access to what information? How do priorities get set within an organization? What are the allies that you work with, inside and outside the organization? What are what's the nature of that culture? Which does it allow for power sharing? Does it not? All of these things which everybody understands is the way an organization works, but is not necessarily visible. So we then spent the next, about 16, 17 years. We co-founded Gender at Work in 2003 and worked with by now, actually, it's over 150 kinds of organizations with whatever the entry point is. It could be, well, come and work on women's leadership, or it could be, come and help us with a policy, a gender policy. Or come and help us with this training program. But whatever the opening was, what we tried to do was to say, what's underneath that? Let's try to peel back that onion and see where the blockages are and what the facilitating factors are. David and I developed, based actually on the integral framework, David and I developed the Gender at Work framework, which now is widely used and is a way that helps you think about the deep structure of organizations and the ways in which individual consciousness, as well as access to resources and the more formal side of organizations interact with or are blocked by these deeper structures in organizations. So our next book that we published was in 2016, which tried to bring together some of the insights that we had learned over all of these years, and working for over 10 years with trade unions in South Africa, working with government programs in India, with multilateral organizations, the United Nations, with big NGOs, with foundations like the Gates Foundation, and try to really think about what can we say more about the deep structures, and what are the pathways that we've actually worked with organizations to try to chip away at that.
Wow. And we're going to link to that 2016 book in the show notes. And I want to assure you, Aruna, it's in my Kindle as we speak.
So I hope you enjoy it.
I can't wait to read it. So that sets the context then. So turning to feminist leadership more broadly, and we'll return to what you term as the deep structures, because I think for some of our audiences that we need to unpack a little bit more still what that means and why it matters. But tell us a little bit, what does feminist leadership mean to you? How does it show up? How do I see it in practice when I enter an organization?
Well, how do you see leadership in practice when you enter an organization? Feminist leadership is grounded in feminism. And that's really important because feminism is a political vision. Mm-hmm. So it's a political vision in terms of trying to, change the structural impediments to equality that are very deep-seated. And those are, and the thing about feminism is that it is focused on gender, but not only on gender. So it is also intersectional. So it's not only looking at gender biases, it's also looking at biases of race and class and ethnicity and religion and other kinds of fault lines that intersect with gender issues, and that set in motion dynamics of hierarchy and set in motion dynamics of discrimination, and raise some and subordinate others. And so processes that are about transforming gender power structures that are discriminatory and practices that are discriminatory of all kinds, whether they're informal or they're formal, in the service of advancing social justice and gender equality, is the way I think of. That's feminist leadership to me. And it's not just in organizations, it's also in ourselves. It's feminist leadership has a self-reflective piece to it. So it's not only about changing you out there that needs to be changed, but it's also about how are all of those biases and attitudes and deep-seated norms, how do they live in me? And so what do I need to change inside of me in order to be able to, be a different person in how I relate to you and how I relate to organizations.
Interesting.
And it's also about movements. And Srilata's work has done, has really extended the feminist leadership work to movements, social justice movements. And so, when we, look now, we're in a perfect storm, right? We're facing multiple crises. It's not just the COVID crisis. We've seen, just in the United States, we've seen, incredible upheaval
Yeah.
With the whole, you know, with the race riots and rioting and, you know, police violence, Black Lives Matter, we've seen huge levels of structural inequality. And, you know, we're heading towards climate extinction, essentially, right? And that context, the context is very important because that then shapes our visions. What is it we do with this context? Where do we want to be? How do we want to get there? I mean, that's part of what an organizational DNA is, right? So organizations are shaped by these contexts. And one of the issues that has emerged more and more now is that we as a society have devalued each other, and we've devalued our own thriving, you know, and our own care.
What do you mean by that?
You know, I think that what we see over and over and over again are organizations that are broken, and they're broken because the people in those organizations are broken. That hierarchies and ways in which traditional organizations, you know, work, they're really 19th century constructs, you know, that are ill-equipped to service our 21st century visions. You know, the organizations we live in, and, you know, I can say this having seen my colleagues and myself having worked for so many years in trying to shift these organizations. You know, you make a little progress, but the default always goes back to hierarchy, and not only to hierarchy, but to, you know, very patriarchal forms of organizing and manipulation. And so you've seen, again, you know, we've seen recently huge rebellion against that. The Me Too movement has just blown up around the world because sexual harassment, abuse, and violence has become so normalized, you know, that it's been under the surface for so many years, and then it just exploded. You know, so when you think about that and you ask the question, what does care mean in relation to that issue? Care means ensuring that there are safe environments and within which people can work. And that means bodily safety. It means mental health. It means, you know, creating the kind of environment where we can engage not only at the level of mind, but also at the level of heart and body, so that we're connecting to each other, you know, in ways that enable us really to thrive.
So I'm going to ask you one kind of a little bit more provocative question, and then I want to dive into those deep structures a bit more for the rest of the interview. Are there any organizational context or any types of organizations where feminist leadership is not very helpful or shows real clear limitations? Because what is needed for those organizations at that point in time is a very different style of leadership.
You know, I think it goes back to my definition of feminist leadership. Feminist leadership is not one thing, and leadership is never one thing. So, you know, there's a misconception that, you know, feminist leadership is all about, you know, people sitting around a table endlessly discussing things, and, you know, and sitting around a kitchen table and just kind of never coming to a decision. You know, that really is a misnomer, and I think it's you know, it's just, that's not what feminist leadership is about. I think that the vision, as I mentioned earlier, is really important. I think that one in different situations, one needs to use different kinds of processes to move forward. But the question is really, you know, what does moving forward mean? What does efficacy mean? what does effectiveness mean, and to whom? Who defines it? You know, so if effectiveness is, you know, ExxonMobil's notion of, you know, providing better dividends to shareholders by drilling more in the Arctic, you know, now that Trump has allowed more drilling in the Arctic, is that effective? To me, that's not part of the vision and the world I want to live in.
A very narrow definition for sure of effectiveness, you're saying.
Yes. And so, you know, when in all kinds of work on organizations and thinking about leadership in organizations, and, you know, you can go to work on integral theory to spiral dynamics, you know, there's just a whole body of work out there that tells you that there's always a balance that's required among the different kinds of needs people have.
Right.
And you know, taking care of those needs, making sure that environment is possible to do that, making decisions, helping people get the resources they need in order to feel safe and productive and valued in an environment, and also kind of pulling their weight to a shared goal. So, you know, I remember learning about Tostan, which is an organization in Senegal, works primarily in health, community health, you know, and one of their new innovations they put into place was something very simple, but it was about creating a safe environment. And that was by making information about salaries, about resources that people have access to, shared information throughout the organization, so that, you know, you're not constantly trying to guess, or you're not constantly suspicious about
wondering
what's happening here. Do I not have the full picture? You know, those kinds of things can erode mental health, can erode people's trust in an organization. And, you know, if you think about the work of people like Margaret Wheatley, Leadership and the New Science, for example, you know, which is now 25 years old, learning from nature, principles of organizations, you know, are all about self-accountability. They're about creating a vision collectively and then creating that environment so that people can move towards that vision. It's not about control, and you know, it's not about power over. So you know, when I think about feminist leadership, you know, I think that it draws on a huge wealth of experience and thinking about what is good leadership. You know,
very interesting.
And really how can we bring those elements together to kind of move towards a vision that doesn't instrumentalize people.
Yeah, that's what I hear you say very clearly. So now I'd like to zero in with you on one particular contribution within your overall thought leadership on feminist leadership. And again, this is on these facets of deep structure in organizations. And you have developed this work together with David Kelleher and together with Sulata Batliwala and Joanne Sandler and Lisa Veneklas, etc., who I'm also interviewing for this series. So let me just, for the sake of our audiences, just walk you through some examples. And I'm just using a slide here that comes from this work. So when we think about deep structures in organizations, to be very concrete, for instance, I'm citing here from your collective work, we're talking, for instance, about unstated personal biases that override the official organizational norms. Right? Personal biases by certain powerful people, whether they in formal power or informal power, doesn't really matter. Or what are the kinds of behaviors that are actually valued or rewarded in practice in an organization rather than what we say we are all about, right? Who are the informal groups or cliques of people who wield indirect power and influence is another example of a deep structure, right? Or how we go about spreading rumors in order to put somebody who we want to put down into a corner, if you will. So it's the kind of informal, covert decision-making, or as you said to me in our discussion before we started the recording, how resources are really allocated, who really has access to the leader, rather than what the formal process will say. So these are some of the practical examples of deep structures in organizations that have to do, of course, with politics and power. So my question to you then is, Aruna, is, if we think that these deep structures of power and politics are probably some of the hardest aspects of an organizational culture to change, right? Hardest for a leader to aspire to change. What are the political or otherwise strategies and tactics that a feminist leader can use to not only analyze these deep structures, but actually to change them? Can you give us some really concrete levers for change of these deep structures?
I want to say, Tosca, just before I begin, that this work around deep structures has much deeper roots than what you've cited. So, for example, Joan Acker wrote about, she did organizational critiques of organizational, or gender critiques of organizational theory. Naila Kabir has written extensively on this. Raven Connell has written about gender power regimes. The whole FIN network, which is the Feminist Institutionalist International Network, among whom is Fiona Mackay, who's a colleague and friend, have written about how power works in institutions. So, there's a long history.
A long history, it sounds
as well as Anne-Marie Goetz, who's wrote about this, some years ago. There's a long history of theory around feminist theory, critiquing organizations and organizational theory and organizational change. And we draw on that. So I just wanted to say that. And I think, again, in terms of, so how do you begin to change it? One of the really interesting ways of trying to shift these deep structures is, and here I'm going back to Eric Olin Wright, who is a well-known American sociologist, a Marxist sociologist who talked about getting to real utopias. And his thesis was, there are kind of three kinds of strategies for making transformation or making change happen. He was talking in terms of class, change in class structures, but it works well when you think about it in terms of gender power structures as well. The first one was symbiotic. You partner with a, say, for example, you partner with a state, which is providing, for example, Gender at Work worked with the largest rural employment program in the world in India, Manrega. So we worked in a few areas in Uttar Pradesh. So we partnered with a government program. Nothing that we did, working with a whole group of local NGOs, challenged the power of the state. So it wasn't about, upturning those power relations, but it was about getting those resources that were meant for certain populations, and in particular for Dalit women that we were working with, available and accessible by those women. What was a deep structure within that organization? A deep structure was the assumption that, and this was nowhere written, that poor Dalit women, illiterate or semi-literate Dalit women, were only able to do the lowest of the lowest menial tasks in this program, which was hauling mud, hauling earth. They were not able to do any technical work. Was that written in any project document? No. Was that in the policy guidelines of Manrega? No, but that was the way the program operated. So what we, in collaboration with working with a whole bunch of organizations that built the consciousness and understanding of the rights, these women understanding their own rights, they then formed a union, was to, in fact, show the system, the program in Uttar Pradesh, that these women were able to do all of these things. So there were a series of innovations. And one of them was training semi-literate women to do those technical tasks. And that training manual then got adopted by the entire program and was used nationally in the program. So, so that's a symbiotic strategy. An interstitial strategy is one where, essentially you're working in the cracks. No organization is monolithic. There are always cracks. They are allies. They are spaces. They are resources. Not in the formal public eye, but just beyond that, where you can experiment with ideas. You can build capacities to do something else. You can try experimenting with a new way of working. And if that works, that can get adopted by the larger organization. So for example, in one of the largest trade unions that we worked with in South Africa called SACAWU, which is for commercial workers in the retail and in the restaurant industries, they had everything in place. They had a gender coordinator, they had a gender policy, but the leadership was, not only primarily, was pretty much completely male.
Yeah.
And there was very little opportunity for women to get into that leadership arena, because the meetings were held at night. Women were not, it was not very safe to travel to these meetings. Women had, this double burden of reproductive care and they were working full-time in the organization. And there were threats of violence and sexual harassment to keep women out of these spaces. So what this organization actually did over a course of a number of years working with Gender at Work in South Africa was to build a kind of a satellite place where women could test their leadership, could try out, new ways of leading. And then because that was working so well, and the union was facing, low, sort of high attrition rates and needed to hold on to members, that model became integrated into the union's model of leadership. So it was, that's an interstitial safe space where they could try things out and change things. And that has worked in many cases. I mean, if you look at, the gay rights movement in the United States, I mean, that's been, really the story of that. The third strategy of that Eric Olin Wright talks about is SMASH. Sometimes, when you cannot change it, when it's time for organizations to die, it's time for organizations to die. Reframing is a strategy that's used a lot by feminists. And I'm sure you can think of a number of examples, So these are the kinds of strategies that feminists use to try to chip away at these deep structures.
Interesting. I'm going to ask you to please send me the links to a couple of these core authors, and particularly if they have shorter, more practitioner-oriented writings that we could share in the podcast, that would be very valuable. Fascinating. Well, Aruna, we have to bring this interview to a close. Where, if people want to find out more about you, where should they go?
Well, the best place to go is genderatwork.org. So there'll be information about myself and my writings, and a number of the writings are available, freely downloadable. And I would encourage people to listen into the Gender at Work podcast.
Yes.
It's really about rethinking feminist transformational strategies. And the third place I would suggest people go to is the Medium blog, which I wrote together with a number of my colleagues, Joanne Sandler, David Kelleher, Lisa Veneklausen, and Srilata Batliwala. And it's called Centering Care and Connectivity in Organizations. And it's about really a new vision of how do we balance human thriving with planetary thriving. How do we build care and connectivity and feminist values into the kinds of organizational formations we need to pursue the kinds of feminist visions that are emerging from, economists like Kate Raworth and the donut model of economy, and some of the most progressive thinking about climate justice and social justice.
Oh, so it's marrying those two. Okay, we are definitely going to link to both, as I said, your 2016 book, your podcast, Gender at Work, and the blog post that you just talked about, so that our listeners can learn more deeply about your extensive body of work. Thank you so much, Aruna, for all your insights. I really admire the depth of thinking that you provide, as you were also citing all these resources. And thank you very much, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then please help other social sector leaders find my podcast by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're interested in the topic that we discussed today and in this series, namely feminist leadership, we have one chapter in our book with George Mitchell and Hans-Peter Schmitz, Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs, where we talk about leadership and leadership models and some blind spots that we see in the INGO sector in particular, and the place of feminist leadership and post-heroic forms of leadership in that. This is Tosca. I look forward to spending time with you on NGO, Soul and Strategy next time.